Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us from across the world. I'm Talia Deckel, Vice President of Content at the Jerusalem Press Club. Last night, we had a fantastic opening night. We were honored to hear from the President of Israel, Ruby Rivlin, and Chief Fact Checker of the Washington Post, Glenn Kessler. We also presented the inaugural Uri Avneri Prize for Courageous Journalism to two Israeli reporters, Orly Bar-Lev, an independent journalist, and Gur Megiddo of The Marker. For those of you who missed it, you can find all our conference content on our website. And remember, you can follow all of our programming on social media platforms. Today's program includes two outstanding journalistic projects covering controversial events in the US and in China, as well as a panel of some of Israel's most prominent reporters who will discuss their experiences during the pandemic. The common denominator for all of our speakers has been the institutional challenges they have faced to try and uncover their stories. Before we begin, I'll remind viewers that if you wish to engage with the speakers, you must log in over Zoom. Our first session today explores the award-winning podcast, The Out Crowd, a project of This American Life. The program deals with the human impact of former US President Trump's Remain in Mexico policy on asylum cases, and is the first to win a Pulitzer Prize for audio reporting in May of 2020. Joining us today are two reporters and a member of the podcast staff who collaborated on the project. Emily Green is a Mexico-based correspondent for Vice News. Previously, Emily freelanced for 3 years from Mexico for numerous outlets, including NPR, Public Radio International, Vice, and The Intercept. Emily worked at the San Francisco Chronicle covering local politics. Molly O'Toole is an immigration and security reporter for LA Times Washington, D.C. Bureau. She served as senior reporter at Foreign Policy, covering the 2016 election and the Trump administration, reported on politics for The Atlantic's Defense One, and was news editor at the Huffington Post. She has reported across the world for the Times, the Washington Post, The Atlantic, the New Republic, Newsweek, the Associated Press, and more. Molly was also a 2020 finalist for the Livingston Awards for Excellence in International Reporting. And Nadia Reiman was the producer of The Out Crowd, for which we are here to speak about. She was senior editor at NPR's Latino USA and the recipient of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists ENYA Award. It is such a pleasure to have you all here with us today. The floor is yours, ladies.
Thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to talk to everyone about our work on The Out Crowd. I am Nadia Reiman. I am the producer of the show. We're going to be talking to each other and sort of interviewing each other through this. So if you see us talking to each other, that's what that is. So we want to start off by sort of talking about how the Out Crowd came together and how we conceptualized the show. So when the Out Crowd took about 6 months, I want to say, from inception to full completion as a project. And it started off because I've been covering immigration for a long time. And when I saw the so-called Remain in Mexico policy start to brew up, it felt to me that it was going to be something that was going to fundamentally change a lot of things in the US, not only in terms of immigration and immigration policy, but also there's this conceptual idea that the US has of itself as a place of refuge and a place of welcoming all kinds of huddled masses. And this was a complete departure from that in a way that I was curious if it was going to have repercussions and long-lasting effects. And so I started to talk to folks on the ground, especially a lot of organizations and lawyers that were dealing with migrants directly that were being affected by this when it first started to roll out. And one of the lawyers I spoke to said to me that they were really shocked at how big this was and that they thought it was bigger than family separation. And so that to me said that there was something about this that needed to be sort of to bear witness to. And so I started to sort of think about how to do that as our show. And we at This American Life, we don't sort of set out and say, okay, I'm going to make a whole show about this concept. We sort of say, I want to do a story about this. But I kind of, from the very beginning, felt that there was so much going on that one story was going to be very hard to find one story that was going to show the breadth of this. And I felt that kind of shaping a whole show around it would give people a sense of how big it was. And, I've been following the coverage of reporters like Emily and Molly for a long time. And it was so excellent and so thorough. And I felt like for some reason, the average listener just wasn't getting the sense of how big this was and wasn't getting really in the weeds of why this mattered in a way that I knew that the immigration reporting community sort of knew, because they were on the ground and covering all of this all the time. So my goal when I started to put the show together was to sort of bring people into this world and let people see how big this was. And so to do this, I was very clear that I wanted just some basic parts. I wasn't exactly sure how the whole show was going to come together, but I knew for sure that I wanted something from the people that were executing these policies. And I started to read up about what those people felt and thought. And when I found Molly's reporting on it, it was by far the piece that I felt was the most human and the most thorough. The breadth of voices that she was able to get from asylum officers and how honest they were being. It sounded like people just sort of talking and having a beer and letting you know what it was like in their office, what it was like in their minds as they were doing this job. And so my first goal was convince Molly to work with us on this. And I knew if Molly said yes, and if we were lucky enough to work with her, then we could sort of build a show at that point. The second part that I really wanted was something about kidnappings, because I knew from talking to sources on the ground that this happened a lot. And I think people didn't quite realize how much it was happening, how massive it was, how much it was almost like people were waiting at the gates where migrants are coming back into Mexico, ready to sort of start this kidnap machine. And so I was working with a producer named Lena, who hadn't done a ton of immigration coverage up to this point. So she was just kind of like, give me anything that you need to do for the show. And I was like, find me a story of a kidnapping. But the thing is that in most cases, it's people with kids. So I want something that sort of shows that. And then we were lucky enough to get Emily's story for that. And we'll get more to that in a minute. And then the first part of the show that you hear, which is the intro where you're in Matamoros, that part came together last. And it came together last because we were sort of looking at different places along the border where we knew tons of migrants were, to sort of show people. I wanted something to show people how big this was. And I wanted people to stop thinking about this as something that happened over there on the other side of the border that I didn't have to worry about. And I wanted people to know that there was this massive situation that we as a country had created. It didn't exist to this level up until this point. And so we sort of thought about different places, and Matamoros was just the biggest place that we could find where we felt like you could really get a sense of it. And so I want to start off by playing you a little bit of just the very beginning of the introduction to the show, because this is a very dark show. And that's something that we knew from the beginning, that it was going to be a show that was going to be hard for people to listen to, that it was going to be emotionally challenging for a lot of folks, but we thought it was important. And one trick that Ira sort of does whenever he does shows like this that I think is just brilliant is that he kind of starts you off with a little bit of joy, and then you slowly descend and descend and descend into the darkness. And I kind of, when I was reporting before, I had this idea that like you just kind of show the hardest stuff and just the toughest thing that you can think of, and that'll grip people, but people get fatigued. And so it's really hard to sort of do that, especially in our field, when I think by the nature of the covers that we do, a lot of what we do is really hard stuff. It's tons of people in very distressful situations that we have to report on. And I think one challenge that we always have is to sort of, how do we keep people engaged and caring about this and not sort of tuning out because they just don't want to deal with pain, kind of. And so this was a trick that Ira used. And when I sent him to Matamoros to report, he and my coworker Aviva found this little boy. And he was sort of the start of the show. So I want you to hear how this kind of starts and how then it descends.
Darwin's 9, and he's a kid who, I don't know, people just give him stuff. When I met my coworker Aviva, he was playing with a soccer ball somebody gave him, eating a taco somebody else gave him. And Darwin's mom was explaining all this.
Can you just describe what just happened?
I have no idea, she says.
A man, as you were talking about that people just give him things, walked by and gave you, how much did he give you? 10?
Yes.
Wow.
10 pesos.
10 pesos.
¿Y por qué te dio eso?
Why'd he give you that, Aviva asked him. Darwin gives a little shrug like, yeah, what can I say?
Porque pensaba que yo estaba pidiendo una moneda.
because he thought I was asking for a coin. His mom says he was just sitting there, eating.
You're like king of the camp.
Que sí, soy el rey del campamento.
Yes, I am the king of the camp, he says. As Aviva sits there with Darwin's mom, Elizabeth, he runs off for 15, 20 minutes at a time, and then returns with cash.
Ay, Dios mío, santo Dios. $5.
$5.
$5. She hugs him.
Ay, tan lindo. Muchachito.
Darwin runs to their tent to pull out all the money he saved and show Aviva. $279, a huge wad of cash, which, for context, they're living in a makeshift tent camp in Matamoros, Mexico, right over the border from Brownsville, Texas. And I mean, like, immediately on the other side, nestled against the U.S. and the Rio Grande and the customs office, you can see the big red arches of the border station. It's so close. Over 2,500 people living here, hoping to get asylum in the U.S. Darwin and his mom came here from Honduras. $279 here is huge. Most people, even the migrants who came with a little money saved, have been here so long they've spent it all. Our family sends us money, his mom says. Lots of families do that. But he brings in so much more than they send.
Es inteligentísimo.
So you go from the very beginning of just hearing him kind of be like the king of the camp to hearing about how there's all these people waiting and how little money goes a long way. And from there, you just kind of get to hear how the people actually live in the camp, how there's no running water, how there's no way of knowing who's in and out, how there's kidnappings. And so from there, it just sort of, you get into the world in a little bit of an easier way. And I think that that's something that audio can do really well. It can transport you into a world in a very different and very intimate way. I think when family separation started to happen, hearing the audio of the kids being separated was a very big moment for the American public. I think up until then, they didn't quite get the breadth of it and the emotional toll of it. So what we were hoping to do with doing something in audio for the Remain in Mexico policy was to do something like that, to sort of get people to feel the emotional breadth of it. And so when we got to work with Molly in her section, which we called the Goodbye Stranger, we knew that part of what was great about it was being able to get these voices and being able to hear the sources that she already had cultivated really talk to people in this way. And so I'm hoping, Molly, you can talk a little bit about just what the collaboration was like and just how you sourced out the story and what it was like for you to sort of work on it in audio as well.
Yeah, I think my experience was a little different, maybe even than Emily's, and I can't wait to hear about some of her experience. Us like working on different parts of the episode means that we still, like to this day, there's some sort of magical mystery about how it all came together. But this was my first real experience working in audio, which I realize makes me just about the luckiest person in the world that got to be with This American Life and on this kind of an episode. But there was a lot that I didn't understand about the differences between those mediums and the challenges of that. It already is challenging enough, as I'm sure I don't have to tell this group, working with anonymous sources, working with people who are really taking risks, essentially whistleblowers, to kind of put their livelihood on the line when they feel strongly about something. And that's already challenging enough in print. So I'm glad that Nadia sort of had this vision, because there were times where I was thinking, how are we going to capture that emotion and how strongly people feel these asylum officers, while also protecting their identity in an audio context. And but like Nadia said, I really feel like I can only do so much with words. Hearing people sort of talk through this emotional journey themselves, hearing them say the words is just so different and so powerful in a way that with writing, I don't think I could fully convey. Emily, you have a lot more experience sort of with audio and video than I do, but I don't know if you feel that way, sort of audio versus the sort of printed word.
Yeah, I think that audio, when there's emotion involved, which was very much the case for all of our stories, that is conveyed much more powerfully in audio and in a way that can't be conveyed in print, although in print you can of course get into a lot more detail. And I think that was the powerful thing for our stories. I wonder, one of the things I wondered, Molly, I don't know if we should play the tape now or later, but when you initially did your interviews with your sources, were you recording them at that original interview? And maybe we should play the tape so folks know what we're talking about.
Well, I think Molly, you did a very thorough print piece first.
Right.
In that one, did you record folks, or were you just taking notes when you were talking to them?
I mean, just as like sort of a best practice, I do tend to record and ask people, but I never think of that. I never think of that as like audio to potentially be used for a podcast, because I'd never done one before. That's more just like a backstop. If you need to go back and listen, you didn't quite catch a quote, that sort of thing. But no, I mean, what this emerged out of was actually like probably about a year of reporting on Reiman in Mexico. And I, like Nadia, was really interested in not the sort of official with the title, but the people like on the front line who were actually implementing this policy, because asylum officers they're kind of amazing experts. They're often immigration lawyers that have like the Immigration and Nationality Act, like the foundation of the US immigration system, basically like memorized in their head, but they also know these intimate details about a dozen countries around the world and the factors that might lead people to leave and seek asylum. They're really amazing people that I was sort of intrigued by their role that they played. They're sort of the protectors of the United States to make sure that people aren't taking advantage of this system. But they also have a very sort of humanitarian job that requires a lot of expertise. And they're hearing people walk through some of the worst moments of their lives. And then they have this sort of power as these gatekeepers to decide whether they make it to the next step. So this had been like the product of months, even a year probably, of building trust with those asylum officers. But then when This American Life approached me, which I was so excited about, we went through that again. We redid the reporting, like the reporting, and not redid, it's even the wrong word, because we were sort of doing fresh reporting where we really could just zero in on that role and how they felt about this policy in a way that I couldn't do in print, because we sort of couldn't get that deep.
You did the interviews.
Yeah.
We went, we also had to like sort of make sure that the asylum officers were on board and that trust that we had built like extended to this, to this medium. Luckily, most of them were fans of This American Life, which was helpful. If they hadn't been familiar with the podcast or the forum, I think it might have been different. But yeah, we went back and we talked to them for hours.
Yeah, we often have to do that, I think, at TAL, just because we're very greedy with our time. Like our interviews are, I think, on average 3 hours. Sometimes they're 4 hours. For most stories that I do, there's at least 2 interviews that are around 3 hours each, just because we have to have people walk us through the moments and sort of give us a reflection and the plot in a way that anybody can sort of follow, because we don't end up knowing what parts are going to end up working. And so, I mean, I think I imagine, Molly, that you had to be like, I know the answers to these, but I'm sorry, I'm asking you all this stuff again. But I'm wondering how the conversations were between you and them to sort of, I guess, to convince them to do this again.
Yeah, I mean, luckily, because This American Life has such a reputation and history for really, I mean, I think This American Life is sort of the founding, program for this kind of long form narrative journalism that isn't audio journalism, that's not in, it kind of, I mean, I feel like Ira's whole thing, right, is sort of like, screw the format, like we're going to reinvent this.
Yeah, a little.
Where it's not sort of narrowly structured around a news event. Like often what I find powerful about This American Life, and I feel like all the podcasts that have sort of come in its wake, is it's often like investigating like a feeling, like an emotion. And that's where I think it like draws its power. And so I think the power of the episode, and including in Emily's section, is sort of the conflict, the inner tension. You like hear people sort of wrestling with their consciences. And so it actually didn't take that much convincing for people. They knew about This American Life, and they knew that they would really engage with the tough aspects of this policy, which is what they were doing themselves. And I think that's why they were willing to talk to me and why they were willing to do this. I think they trusted that This American Life would do justice to the stories, not just the asylum officers, but also the people being impacted, obviously, by the asylum policy. At first, particularly with Doug, who's the named asylum officer, he's on the episode as himself, speaking in his own voice. When I first connected with him, I actually first connected with him basically when he had just become what's believed to be the first asylum officer in the country to refuse to do this policy. Essentially like kind of refuse work orders. And over a couple months, I'd kept in touch with him, and ultimately he decided to come on the record on the episode in his own voice, to not be anonymous. And that, I think, also lends a lot of power to the episode, is him in his own voice. I think it probably would have been different not that it wouldn't have been powerful, but I think it would have been different. We didn't have to.
I think it would have been different. I think it really was amazing that he decided to do that, and I feel very grateful that he decided to do that, because I do think having him in contrast. I also think that maybe it's a good time to talk about how we use the voice actors for the ones who wanted to be anonymous. One of the things that we struggled with, and Molly and I talked about this a lot, and we also talked about it internally with editors of This American Life, was how to keep Molly's sources protected when we did the story. Obviously, when you have an anonymous source in print, you can do it. There's kind of like not a lot of there's a lot of back end gymnastics, but front end, you could just write it and say the source said, right? But when we're going to do it in audio, we were like, how do we do this? How do we make sure that these folks are protected? And we went through sort of like a bunch of different ideas for how to guarantee their anonymity and how to make sure that they weren't going to be outed. And we discussed changing their voices with software. We discussed like pitching them down, doing all of these different things. But ultimately, I think for us as audio makers, we knew that you could just put that through a program and undo it. And we weren't really, I think, as fully aware as I think Molly was at that time, that the people, their bosses at USCIS would be very intent in figuring out who these folks were. And so, Molly and I talked about it, and we were both kind of like, I don't want to do anything that like even remotely puts at risk their identity being revealed in some way, shape, or form. And so we decided to use voice actors, which was something that we also then had to discuss internally, because our jobs are also to present a journalistically sound piece of work to our audience. And we want to make sure that the audience doesn't even think for a second that we're pulling their leg or that we're doing anything to obscure any sort of meaning. And so we decided to cast folks for the 2 asylum officers that wanted to be anonymous. And it was a really interesting exercise, because we essentially were looking for actors who were not going to act. Like, we just needed actors who were going to lend us their vocal cords and sound like this person. And so we went through a bunch of takes where I refused to send them anything that they could download on the internet so they could practice. So I played them stuff on the phone so that they could audition. And when I found the 2 that I felt were, comfortable with it and also liked the story, liked the show, wanted to do a good job, we hired them. And then we played it for them live in the studio and just had them sort of like parrot back what people were saying over and over again until it sounded as close to the person as possible. And it was interesting because one of the officers, the one that we call Anne, they were very emotional in their tape. They had, I think, the most emotion out of the people that we talked to. And so when you have an actor, you kind of have to be like, okay, I need you to get this feeling of this person, but I don't want you to fake cry. I don't want you, because then it ends up sounding acted. And this is what it ended up sounding like with the voice actor.
I'll say this, the administration's been successful.
What do you mean?
They want negative decisions. They don't want asylum seekers in this country. They don't want people to get positive decisions or determinations for asylum. They have felt that the standards for screening interviews were too low, and they wanted those standards changed and those standards raised, and they've succeeded.
What do you think the administration's end goal is?
No more people from shithole countries.
Anne throws up in the shower almost every day. She has recurring nightmares. She says she can't focus, can't sleep. She thinks about the people she's returned to Mexico all the time. It's nearly 100. But there's one family in particular that she can't stop thinking about. A father and son.
Why do you think that case sticks with you?
Kid was really young. What happened to him? Did his kid get kidnapped? He get murdered? It's happening. It's happening a lot.
What was that?
And then, what's my moral culpability in that? I interviewed that case, and my signature's on that paperwork. And that's something now that I live with. So, yeah, I feel in some ways that this administration's made me a human rights abuser.
So
Can I just say, that was like for me listening for the first time, because I didn't listen to their section before the piece came out, which is kind of crazy. Like I only listened to Molly and Nadia's, the whole thing besides for mine, the day that the piece aired. And I heard the section and it just sent chills down my spine. It was so, so, so powerful. And I guess I have so many questions about this, but one just basic one is out of curiosity, how many voice actors did you interview before you came upon her? Like before you decided this was the one?
it was about 3, so it wasn't bad. We have somebody that works in our staff that does a lot of the rights to films part of our job. And she knows a lot of casting directors. And so I was sort of running around being like, okay, I need voice actors, but I need voice actors that are chill and that are going to be okay being directed, and they're going to like not overact, and also that care about this. And also I can't send them anything and I can't tell them anything about it until I talk to them. And so she set me up with a bunch of people through a casting director that fit that description. And so then I just sort of listened. I watched the reels. I listened for voices that sounded at least like tonally a little bit in the same ballpark as Anne and as Ursula. For the two of them, amazingly, Ursula was the easiest to cast. That voice actor came in and she just read and it sounded exactly like her, and it was like 2 takes, and I was like, okay, we're done, you know. But this one was a little more difficult because of the emotion, you know, and because of trying to get the emotion right and not having it come off over the top. Yeah, so it was like maybe like 3 people for this one before we ended up with the person that did it.
And can I, like, when you redid the interview, Molly, did you revoice your questions, or did you pull your questions from your original interview?
I think it was the original, but
it was the original. Yeah, it was the original. We have everybody on 2 separate mics. So there was no, thankfully for the parts we ended up using, there was no bleed through of the actual person. And I think maybe at one point there was, but we were able to mask it by putting the voice actor over it. So it sounded the same. But those are Molly's live questions with the asylum officer. The only thing different is the asylum officer's voice has been swapped.
Clearly you can tell, because I probably shouldn't have like interrupted them, but it's just sort of like your impulse. There's part of print reporting too that you have to learn how to interview a little bit differently, where, you know, it's sort of, you take your chances when there's a pause or something, you sort of get the next thing in. And that's something Nadia really helped me with. I mean, you have the opportunity to let people like really sit through their emotions and work through it. So yeah, that part is very faithfully conveyed, my interrupting.
But honestly, those
For
parts,
me, it sounds
we love
natural.
those parts because it sounds exactly, that's how people talk.
Yeah.
Like I love those parts. It's simply, I also love when people swear, because I feel like that's when they're comfortable, like they're being the most themselves.
Because
So
for me, the power is like, I like forgot that they were voice actors. I mean, I like the interruptions too, because you say clearly they're voice actors and then you promptly forget. And I think that was so powerful to me, because I would have assumed that the whole time I'd be thinking these are voice actors, it's not the real person, but I didn't feel that way at all.
Well, I'm glad, because that was a balancing act that we had to do journalistically, because we really wanted to say these are voice actors, and we don't want people to hear that and then be like, by the way, not the real person, you know? And we also wanted to make sure that people knew. So we said, I think Ira said something like, we had them replicate the emotion and the way that people spoke as closely as possible, so that people knew that if the voice actors were getting sad, it's because the asylum officer was getting sad. It wasn't the voice actor trying to juice up some kind of part of the story for dramatic effect.
Right. Yeah, even listening now, you forget that they're voice actors, because knowing who these people are too, I almost forget. Sorry, I'm like, go ahead.
I was gonna ask, sorry, I think there's a delay, but were the asylum officers nervous? Like, as the episode got closer and closer to airing, were you having to call them up and say, don't worry, was there ever any fear that they'd back out?
Actually, no, which may seem kind of surprising. It actually was pretty quick after we spoke to them for a whole lot of reasons. And I know that's not how poor Nadia like normally necessarily works.
No, I feel bad for you, because it was your first experience with TAL, and then we were like, by the way, you're going to do everything in 2 weeks.
Yeah. I think if there had been like more of a delay, some stories like can, especially sort of investigative stories, they can take like 6 months, which is a luxury that some people have in their jobs journalistically, and some people don't. And you do have to kind of keep people's trust and earn their patience. But there's a lot of sort of walking people through being transparent about what we do and how journalism can work. But in this case, I think we were lucky, because I think they understood what we were trying to do, and it was fairly quick. They didn't have to wait too long, and sort of Doug had made this active choice to be on the record. Although you can hear in some of his audio that he certainly was emotional, but I think he was a little nervous. I think they understood I think they even understood in a way that perhaps I didn't, because I was too in the weeds of this policy. I don't know if you feel this way too, Emily. But I think they understood even in a way that I didn't, how big this was going to be. But didn't seem nervous about it. They seemed to sort of welcome it. I think because they were playing this sort of whistleblower role, they wanted this out there, even if maybe they were a little nervous. But that actually didn't happen, which might be a little bit surprising. I mean, did you have to sort of go through that too, Emily? I know we're going to listen to and get more into your section, but sort of keeping people's trust and helping them understand what this process was going to be?
Yes, but not maybe to the same extent, because it's not like the people I was featuring, to be fair, had ever heard of This American Life. Like they didn't know, right. They like literally, even when we won the Pulitzer, I remember I called up one of the sources and I told her I won this big prize, and she said, oh, that's great. And I said, it's like the Oscars of acting. Oh, that's great. I mean, this is just not a world that they operate in.
Yeah.
Molly, I'm wondering if you can talk, I think you started to, but I want to hear more about just the impact of this reporting, like what happened afterwards, and what did you think about that?
Yeah, I reporting on immigration under the Trump administration was certainly an interesting experience. There was a lot of unprecedented things about the Trump administration, whatever your politics. There's a lot of sort of talk about the media as fake news, and how there was a sort of deep state that was sort of opposing the Trump administration from the inside. And it was really interesting seeing people's reactions, particularly to the asylum section, because it was sort of one of two things. Either people were really upset at the asylum officers for remaining part of the Trump administration, for like staying on the job. And if they were opposed to this policy in such a visceral way, why did they keep doing it? Or people on the other side who maybe were upset that there were these like quote unquote moles in the administration who who didn't believe in his policies. But like, of course, that happens in federal government. It's a huge thing made up of humans, made up of human beings who have their own opinions and feelings about, even as they're doing their jobs and doing their jobs faithfully, like they can be conflicted about that. So those reactions were really surprising, but it wasn't necessarily surprising that within the government itself, that I was sort of made aware by some of the asylum officers in the episode and by others that there was a sort of quote unquote witch hunt going on to sort of try and find the sources, whether for this podcast or for some of the reporting. There was a lot of mistrust within the government. And this sort of became part of that, where people were sort of trying to find them. And then not just my reporting, other people's reporting as well. But that was one response sort of from this episode where they sort of reiterated that you're not supposed to talk to reporters if you're sort of a everyday civil servant. The act of speaking became political under the Trump administration. I suppose in a way it always has been, but especially in this sort of hyper-polarized environment around immigration. And to this day, I don't think that they have ever found them.
Yeah, I don't think they have.
But it was definitely something, it was something, it was sort of an active response to the podcast.
And when you were talking with them, were you using things like Signal or Telegram, or were you just on, maybe I shouldn't ask this, but I just wonder if you took real precautionary measures, or if that was a fear for you that they would start tapping your communications.
I mean, I probably should have even better practices than I do in terms of like digital security, but it is something that, especially like over the last few years, I would say, and the more you start to work with anonymous sources, especially like within the federal government, try to be like more and more careful about, using encrypted messaging, definitely try not to put names or certain details like in any messages at all, disappearing messages, and to the extent that we could, like tried to use that. But I know that even Nadia like took precautions, and I'm sure you do as well, Emily. But it's a real challenge for journalists right now. But also I feel like the technological capabilities are such that there are also a lot of ways in which you can protect communications that maybe didn't exist before. But I think even with the episode itself, you were like pretty careful, right, Nadia?
Yeah, we didn't have anything. We normally have transcriptions of the interviews sent outside to get them transcribed and bring them in, but we didn't do that. We did all the transcriptions in house. We didn't put them up on Temi or any of those like, robot logs to do anything. So we made sure that nothing was in a hackable place as much as we could, just in case. But that's like the extent of where, and like I said, we didn't send anything that was downloadable, like no voices were sent over the internet, which is very, it's different for us because we all work very much off of the internet. I feel like everybody does. Let's move on to talk about your section, Emily, just because I want to make sure that we have time for people to ask questions too.
Sure.
So for this part, for your section, which we called Take the Long Way Home in the episode, I'm wondering if you can start off by talking a little bit about how we sort of reached out to you in that collaboration, because that was even something that I was peripherally involved in, but not as directly involved in. And what it was like for you to sort of do this in addition to your work with Vice at that time.
So I had done this story for Vice, and I knew at the time the audio I had was pretty incredible. I felt that the next thing I'm going to say might be a bomb to freelancers, but I wrote This American Life and I pitched them this story, and then I heard crickets.
I'm sorry.
I heard nothing. So then, which is to say, as a freelancer, do not get down if your freelance pitch does not get responded to, because it might win a Pulitzer. And then I then very luckily, fortuitously, the producer I was working with, Lena, reached out to a reporter for the New Yorker magazine, and Jonathan Blitzer, and he's a gem of a human being, and he responded, "The person that you should talk to is Emily Green. She's done the most reporting on this." And Lena wrote me, and I said, "Well, funny that you wrote me. I sent you a pitch that you never responded to." And
we'll talk about how to
and
pitch
that's-
this American life in a way that it doesn't get sucked into a dark hole, because there's ways.
There's ways. So all this is to say, for me, I feel this whole thing has been so serendipitous. And that, Lena reached out, Jonathan Pulitzer was a gem. I think this is to say, and now I'm not freelancing, but as a freelancer, you really rely on the generosity of others in so many ways. And so that's how it happened. But I did say I knew from the beginning that the material I had was really quite incredible. And I give it, like, as soon as really anybody at This American Life read the pitch, I think that they also realized this. And sometimes it's a question of just getting your stuff before eyes. And that's always a difficult process sometimes.
It really is. It was incredible. Like when Lena came to me and was like, what about this story? I was like, absolutely. Where has this story been? And then once we got the tape from Emily, it's just, you get to hear this moment sort of happen live in a way that I don't think people normally get to hear. Like, you get to hear the sort of bargaining that goes behind the nitty gritty, the kind of stuff that goes behind these interactions. I think we have such like a narcos idea of what kidnappings are like. And it's not really how it is. And this was just it felt so special and so real. I want to play it for folks so you guys can hear just this amazing live tape that Emily was able to get of the cartel negotiating with the family member.
It was getting dark out, and I'd been told not to stay in Nuevo Laredo past dusk. I crossed back into the U.S. to go to dinner, probably not a mile away from where I'd last seen David. And my phone rang. It was David's sister. I'll call her Laura. She had my number because it was my phone he called her from earlier today. She was crying so hard I struggled to understand what she was saying. She tells me David and his son had been kidnapped just hours after I left them. She'd gotten a call from a cartel demanding ransom. Laura says that the cartel told her the ransom was $9,000 for David and another $9,000 for his son, so $18,000 total. They put David on the phone briefly so she knew he was alive, and then the kidnappers got on. Okay. And I told them, where in the world are we going to get this money? The man on the other end told her she had to get the money. He said he'd call back tomorrow. I asked Laura to record the phone calls.
Buena.
And she did. When they called the next day, she put them on speaker and used a relative's phone to shoot video of it.
Es que no tengo nada, estoy viendo la manera, pero nosotros no tenemos dinero, muchachos. Viera cómo estamos ahorita de los nervios.
They tell her, I need you to deposit the money as soon as possible, viejita. Viejita means old lady. Laura is 38. She tells them, again, that she has no money, that she's sick from anxiety. In her conversations with me, Laura is scared, crying. But when she talks to the kidnappers, she holds it together. She asks if David and his son are okay. The kidnappers tell her they have food, that they can bathe, for now. Each call only lasts a few minutes.
So yeah, I think once we heard that tape, we were like, this is incredible. Like, it's just incredible to get to see in that world. And I'm just amazed that you were able to get that.
Yeah. How did you get it? I mean, that's one of my questions. I mean, it's amazing that, like, as a freelancer, also, like, this serendipitous thing happened where you could be connected with This American Life. And as a former freelancer, I sympathize so hard. But how did you get this tape? Like, that's one of my main questions. And then how you grappled with, like, your own role, like you sort of found yourself in the middle of hostage negotiations, essentially. Yeah. Like, how did you get the tape, and then how did you handle your own role in this?
Well, because Spanish is not my first language, I record everything. And I think that's just a reminder that sometimes the thing that slows you down, and sometimes I'm just like, God, I wish I spoke Spanish better and could write Spanish better, is also the thing that makes tape
that also can be beneficial. And so in some ways, I feel very lucky that Spanish wasn't my first language in making this, because I got all this kind of tape that I might not have otherwise, because I could have just written it down. But essentially, I met this man on a bridge. He and with his son, and he was terrified of being kidnapped, and he asked to borrow my phone to call his sister in the United States, and I lent him my phone, which I've had a lot of questions about the moral implications of lending somebody my phone, and that could be a whole 3-hour-long discussion. But at any rate, I made that decision to do that. This sister called me a few hours later, said her brother had been kidnapped. And I recorded everything. I mean, it just in part because she was crying. I was having trouble understanding her. I wanted to make sure I got everything. And so when I was recording it, I wasn't thinking about audio in that moment. But I did ask her to record the negotiations with the cartel. And I think there was maybe a couple reasons going on. I mean, at that moment, I had no relationship with this family. I didn't know them from anybody. And I wanted to make sure perhaps that I wasn't being taken advantage of. And so there was part of me that was like, I need a little proof. Like I just need, but I also knew there was another part that was like, we hear about this all the time. Like, if we could have proof, this would be incredible. And so I did ask her to record it. And the amazing thing about Laura, that's the sister of the kidnapped victim, is she managed to do it. She is an incredibly resourceful human being. And I never ceased to be amazed by just how resourceful, because honest to God, if someone said to me, record the ransom or the extortion calls, I would be like, how do I do that? You know, and the fact that she figured out how to do that was incredible. In terms of being in the middle of it, it was terrible. I'm not gonna lie, it was like I felt pretty crazy for about a month. And it was really hard. And I think that sometimes now that we've received so much accolades for this show, and I know that it ended up okay, it's easy to forget. But I was out of my mind, to be honest. I really remember like one day trying to take a run as this was going on and just sitting down on a park bench and crying. And it was bad, you know. And so I think that, I guess another thing, sometimes when people are feeling really crazy in stories, I have to say, well, maybe it'll go somewhere great. But sometimes the best stories can really be very, very difficult emotionally, especially in the immigration beat. And it's something like Molly and I've said to Molly, I was like, I personally want to move away from kidnapping, because it is a very
yeah, I can't imagine like just covering that over and over again.
Yeah, it really is. It's not fun.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you know what happened afterwards? Like what happened to the family?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm still in touch with the family. I mean, so this family, the father and son who were kidnapped, they eventually went back to Honduras because it just was untenable that they were going to stay in this incredibly dangerous city and apply for asylum. But the amazing thing is they made it to Spain, of all places. And I think that goes to, it goes to show like this was not the poorest of the poor. Like, this was a businessman. This is someone who was forced to flee his home, but he had a passport. And I think sometimes when we think about asylum seekers, we're just literally thinking of the absolute poorest of the poor, but that's not the case. And so he made it to Spain, unfortunately, right as a pandemic hit. I still talk to him and his son. They call me, at least once every 2 or 3 weeks, to be honest. They call a lot. And it's an unusual connection that we would have, I would say. And I think that in the making of the show, there were many questions about what were my ties to this family. And they were hard questions. And, people have asked me a lot about this moral implication of being a journalist and also being in the middle of someone's worst nightmare, and how do you deal with that are you a neutral standby do you just sort of stand by neutrally, or do you get involved, or what extent do you get involved? And to be honest, I don't think there's clear-cut answers. But I was very scared in the making of this episode, actually, and I expressed some of this fear that it would be a backlash on me, that my decisions would be
questioned.
Yeah, I was scared. And of course it's worked out, but I was, like, there were so many uncertainties in the reporting of this and the making of this, and it's all turned out a million times better than I could have ever imagined. But like, there were a lot of questions and anxieties.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard situation to be in. And part of the reason why the tape that you were able to get was so good and so intimate is because it was a hard sort of gray area situation that you found yourself in, you know? I doubt that that type of tape and that type of access would have been given to you if it was very clear cut. And I also just think that sometimes reporting can get messy in that way. And it's just, I don't know how to avoid that messiness as part of reporting it, rather than being, all I can think of is, you know, one of the things that I liked and appreciated about your story was, you know, that you were upfront about the parts that you felt messy about. And I think that immediately, to me, gave the story a lot of power because it had all of your honesty behind it.
I will say that was very much This American Life, and I probably would have been a lot less forthcoming. And I gave it to This American Life because I was scared, you know. I didn't feel like saying some of, like, it's not that I thought I made the wrong decision. I thought I did, but I also didn't really want to put it out in the world. And I will very much, I give it to This American Life because y'all insisted on it. And I think it was one of the, if not perhaps the most powerful part of the tape was sort of going into that. And so, but I was hesitant and I was scared. And there was even a part very, like, early on in the reporting process, I almost pulled out.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, we're glad you didn't.
Yeah, I'm glad I didn't too. But, you know, I think these are messy questions. And as you say, Nadia, like, that was very powerful. And I'm so glad that This American Life insisted on it. But there was one paragraph, or like, not paragraph, but one portion of the piece that probably got rewritten 10 times with 10 different voices.
Just so you know, that's normal.
Yeah. The
type of rewriting that we do, that's very normal. But I'm glad you were on board, and I'm really grateful for your part of the interview. And I also don't know if I've told you guys this, but there's been some immigration lawyers that have reached out to me and said that they have used parts of this episode, your part specifically, Emily, to use as evidence of journalists saying that country conditions in Mexico are not safe, to help their clients make their case for trying to skip MPP back when that was still a thing that I think people were trying to do. I want to make sure we leave. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. No, I just want to say, like, and I think the most disturbing thing, and Molly's documented this extremely well, is that this continues. Like, these kidnappings continue.
Yeah.
So, and finally, one other thing that I want to say, and then we can move on. The 3-hour interviews that This American Life does is not normal.
Yeah, no, it's not.
I did radio for a long time, and my rule was no longer than 25 minutes.
Yeah, no, it's very much an us only thing, which is why I feel the need to explain to people all the time that we are sorry, we're very time greedy. Thank you so much. We probably will talk to you for more than you want to talk to us, but that's kind of how it goes.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that we leave time for questions. Yeah. I don't know if you guys have anything else that you want to ask of each other before we turn it to everybody else.
We could do this all day, I'm sure. So let's take some questions.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you guys. That was just really, really both interesting and difficult to hear about. The issues themselves that you've been reporting on are not easy at all to cover. We have a question from Israel asking how your team dealt with the emotional aspects of the job.
Wow, I don't think we're all still sort of dealing. I mean, at TAL, we're all still sort of dealing with the emotional aspects of the job. I think that's something that we as reporters haven't quite figured out, is how to give ourselves the time to sort of admit that what we have to report on affects us. And I don't know if you guys feel the same way, Emily and Molly. I know you guys are on the ground a lot more than I am. So,
well, and Emily even way more so than me. You know, I'm based in Washington D.C. So I sort of have to like convince people to let me out of the Capitol. But you know, and then with the pandemic, that also has totally changed the dynamic of what we do in a way that you're doing this like very emotionally wrought, sort of high stakes life. You know, some of these situations are sort of life and death, and now you're doing it over the phone. To you know, a lot of times. And that's really hard too. But yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we as journalists should talk about it more. I think it's really difficult, but I don't think we should like sort of pull back from our humanity. I think to the extent that we can, we should like lean into it. And I think that's what this episode does. But it is really draining. Just feeling this sort of responsibility to the story, to these people, and hoping that you do the right thing. Like Emily, like just hearing you sort of grapple with that. Yeah, it's really hard. And I think we should be more transparent about that so that people understand that that's an aspect of the job, too.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just add,
No, go ahead.
sometimes I was going to say, sometimes you need to take a break. I mean, I think there was a point after this episode came out and I was talking to asylum seekers and they were telling me horror stories and I'd be like browsing Facebook, you know, like fucked up shit that I was doing. And I was like, oh, I need to take a break from this because I don't have the emotional capacity to listen to your story in a way that does you justice. And so I think that's also a recognition sometimes that you have to take a break so that you can then recharge and go back in and do justice to somebody's story.
But it's been nonstop for
I know.
years now.
Yeah.
I think that's something we have to think about too. It's not like all of this stopped with the 2020 election. Very different approaches between these two presidents to immigration, but like Emily said, a lot of these things are still happening. So yeah, recognizing that you need that space and having the support to do that is so important.
So another question that came in, you talked about a witch hunt for your sources. Were you ever concerned with spins? Maybe there were those out there trying to change the story with the people that you were interviewing?
Just if I understand the question, sort of like spin in terms of how people were going to try and spin the story sort of after it was.
No, the actual
done?
sources that you interviewed, you talked a lot about finding sources that were reliable. Was there ever a concern that you would actually fall upon a spin, a source that was planted there perhaps by someone with a different interest in shaping the story?
In this case, no, but I think that also is partly because I had built this relationship with these sources like very painstakingly over a pretty long period of time, especially in journalism, right? Like a year is like an eternity. And I think, yeah, at the beginning of those kinds of sourcing relationships, you're kind of testing each other out. You know, what are and you really do have to examine like, what are these people's motivations? What are my motivations? And how do they know what they know? And that's definitely part of building sourcing relationships, building that trust. You know, you have to build that trust in each other while still being able to maintain your sort of, you know, your journalistic like incredulity, like to sort of, your baseline is to be a cynic, right? But we had built these relationships over a long period of time. Had it not been that way, had I just like, my first call with them was last week. I don't think that this ever would have come together like this. So if it hadn't been that way, I think it would have been different. But at this stage, like the stage in which we did the episode with these sources, I was not worried about that. How the episode was going to be perceived, like, and spin that way. It's always something that like we're concerned about, especially in a really hyper polarized political environment. But at some point you just have to do your best work and kind of put it out there in the world and let that go. Like you're concerned about how other people will perceive it. But that aspect of spin, it is something that I have to like actively work to let go, that someone's going to sort of misinterpret a story.
Just one more question. I see that we're almost out of time. We do have a few more follow-up questions, so what we haven't had time for, we'll send to you separately. Molly, you said that each episode had to be created from scratch. So how then did you guys decide how each theme would be presented, which would go into each episode, and how that would look?
You mean each interview? Each
Yeah.
interview was redone from scratch.
Yeah, I think Nadia probably could even speak better to that. I mean, we knew we wanted to talk to them about this policy and their experience with this policy. That was that was the framework, but
it was. And I think one of the useful things about it was Doug had a very clear plot to what happened to him. Like he had like a moment when he decided he didn't want to do it anymore. He wrote a letter, he took action, he quit. So it's like that was like something that gave us like a structure for that story. Because we knew that there was like a beginning, a middle, and end to what Doug had to do. So that was sort of like the backbone to that story was the actions that Doug took. Since for both Anne and Ursula, it was more them talking about the impacts of the job. But they all ultimately, we asked them all a similar timeline. Like, what was the moment that you knew that, like, when was the first time that you thought this policy was wrong? What was it about it that made you think it? What did you do? What did you say? What did you feel afterwards? What happened next? It was like a lot of that just to kind of get a lay of the land from them. And it also, I think, was helpful to me just to have them all sort of talk about the same time period, because we kind of got to see from different sides how it gave us a sense of like how the like people in that office were feeling, or in that agency were feeling, just from hearing like these three different sides. And in terms of selecting what audio went in, I mean, I think one thing that Molly and I would do after each interviews, we would sit in the car and we'd say like, what were your favorite parts? And we just jot them down. And we kind of knew that at least some of those would end up on the episode, because those are like the parts that jumped out to her. And it was important also for me as her producer to like hear what parts she was interested in, to make sure that those also stayed as part of the episode. And then the rest was just honestly listening to the tape and pulling whatever tape felt like it was going to have an emotional impact and was going to help like the frame of Doug's action, basically.
Which I guess is sort of the opposite of Emily. It's like you had this tape and knew it was powerful.
Yeah.
But yours was also very action. I mean, there was clearly like
a very plot,
plot and action happening, like real life. Real life, not a plot that you'd have to like invent. It was like before you. So, but being able to see that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the way you guys structured your story was so incredible, because there wasn't an obvious narrative plot, and I thought about that a lot. Like it's not something that obviously is a beginning, middle, and end. Although now that you say that about Doug, I'm going to go back and re-listen to that part. But
I mean, I always need something like that, because I'm not sophisticated enough to come up with how to make a story with like no plot. I'm like, I need some action to hang this onto. So even if it's little, and it was, I think in the grand scheme of things, like I saw this thing at work and then it made me mad and I quit, is like not like a very like complex or compelling plot line, but because of who Doug is and who these asylum officers were or are, and sort of their thoughts and feelings as part of the whole system, I think that raised the stakes a lot for that plot line.
All right, guys. Well, I'll just finish up by saying that you have a lot of fans in Israel for This American Life.
Oh.
We're all very excited to see what's next. Thanks so much, Emily, Molly, and Nadia.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.